Oh man, Honkai 2.5 version 3's out. I wonder what changed. Okay, let's see. Feixiao got buffed. Wait, no, she got nerfed. Wait, no, she got nerfed then buffed. What about Moze? Okay, insane buffs? Yo, what the Skott doing? Yeah, I need him on my team. I need my GodKing now! Sorry about that, and hello! We finally got the version 3 changes for 2.5 a few days ago. Sorry I'm late. There are still 2 versions till the release, so this is subject to change. But let's get straight into it, starting with Lingsha as she's had the least amount of changes. I won't be going over Kit in detail, but if you do want to know how she is and my opinion, you can still watch my previous video going over Lingsha as not too much has changed. So my thoughts still mostly stand. So for Lingsha, she's gotten 3 changes, starting with her trace 1. We can see here that the values were slightly buffed by 25%. What does this mean? Well, before version 3, the amount of break needed to hit this cap was 250, and now it's been reduced to 200. I don't think it's the biggest buff, but it is one nonetheless. Next is the important change, that being her talent. Fuyun has had its speed increased by 10, going from 80 to 90, but has lost 5 toughness damage in the process, now putting it in line with her basic and skill. The speed, while being increased, shouldn't affect any gameplay interactions, and as such, I would consider this a nerf. Now, the 5 toughness damage loss in the follow-up attack honestly sucks a little. This loss in toughness damage does not affect the initial break damage, as that does not factor in toughness damage. But this does, however, impact the super break damage Lingsha can do. It is a 33% damage decrease for super break, as going from 15 to 10 is 33% less. So while I guess this can help Lingsha not steal breaks from break DPSs like Boothill and Firefly, I honestly don't like the change too much, as it means less toughness damage and as such damage in general as well. And with Hule coming out with a metric buttload of toughness, I don't think that was the move. For this next part, I will compare Gallagher and Lingsha again with their toughness damage capabilities. I will use the next boss Hule so you know what we're up against. Unfortunately, I can't find any footage where we explicitly see the toughness amount that Hule has, but by using a Boothill with max pocket trick shots and Ron Mei, which deals 75 toughness damage, and by measuring the pixels on the screen, I will have to assume that Hule has 240 toughness. Now, let's see how impactful this is by comparing against Gallagher. Just note that 10 toughness is how much a basic attack generally does. I will test out in theory a single target and 3 enemy scenario on the 0th cycle with no Ron Mei, as we can take out the common factor. I won't test 5 targets because Lingsha at that point would clearly win. So pre-nerf in a single target situation, Gallagher would win by 1.5 basic attacks worth of toughness damage, while in a 3 target situation, Lingsha would win by 8 basic attacks worth. Now with version 3, in a single target scenario, Gallagher would now win by 2.5 basic attacks worth, and in 3 targets, Lingsha would win only by 4. Again, it's up to you if you believe this is sizable or not, but me personally, I don't really like it. And lastly, her E6 got 1 more hit, going from 3 to 4. For those crazy enough to get this, including her E1, your Fuyun's toughness damage went from doing 45 in a single target situation to dealing 45 in a single target situation. So for those E6 players, nothing changed besides the break conversion. Overall, with these changes, it may be a bit difficult to justify pulling her if you do have an E6 Gallagher. He really is just so good, especially with more people testing the goofy stuff he can do, like quid pro quo with Robin, and most people just don't really need Lingsha right now. But if you like her, then of course you should pull her. But if I had to place her in a Pride Wins tier list, she's honestly on the border of 0.5 and 1 with Luocha, and you can argue for both sides, but I'd honestly put her near Luocha in the MOC tier list. Next would be Feixiao with a whopping 15 changes. But before anything, I want to say I saw some people dooming over these changes, saying it was a GG nerf, but after some Feixiao mains did their math, it seems to be a slight buff. Well, let's just see which is true. And we can start by looking at her base stats and traces to see how it compares. Feixiao in version 3 has 601 base attack and 112 speed, dropping from 125 from the previous versions. So her base speed before was the fastest in the game, beating even Tldr by 10, who has a speed of 115. But now she's tied for being the third fastest in the game, that being Ting Yun, with the second actually now being Moze. Her base attack is also one of the lowest for 5-star DPSs and is actually in line with Fire Trailblazer and her companion Jiao Cho, and yes, even under Hook. This is fine because it's balanced with her self buffs and scaling, which I'll get to later. Next will be her traces. She lost 5 speed from her traces and got 12.5 defense instead. So rather than having a full offensive trace lineup like Acheron, she's by the way the only one to have something like that to my knowledge, it now is exactly like Dr. Ratios and in line with our other DPSs. The main thing to note is that pre-nerf, Feixiao would have started with a whopping 130 speed, which is pretty crazy as you could hit the 134 mark with literally 2 substats. These changes overall meant you could no longer do a hyper speed Feixiao, which I wouldn't have recommended anyways because the damage you would lose from not going offensive substats, but rather the important thing is that it'd now be difficult to go attack boots as you need a decent amount of speed, meaning you lose around 486 attack if you're running the Aeon Light Cone. I want to note that the main thing regarding Feixiao's speed is that she never needed to be that fast, just fast enough to not get lapped by her teammates. This is because her follow-up attacks triggered by her teammates reset on her turn. So unless you had like 100 speed teammates and Feixiao was 200, then you probably wouldn't get additional follow-up attacks from someone like a veteran spamming his follow-up attacks. Her basic is just like any other basic with a scaling of 100. No changes and not much to note. Next to tackle will be her main trace, which her kit will revolve around. Just like Acheron, she doesn't require any energy but require hits on the enemy to generate her flying Aureus stacks. Every 2 attacks generates 1 Aureus stack which Feixiao can stack and up to a total of 12. And this means that any character which can attack multiple times can greatly increase the stack generation. Feixiao also launches a follow-up attack every time a teammate attacks, which is limited to 1 attack per teammate, which the limit is reset every time it's Feixiao's turn. So if Feixiao attacked, and then Aventurine did a basic, Feixiao would then launch a follow-up attack. But if Aventurine then launches another follow-up attack, this will not launch another Feixiao follow-up attack, but it will generate 1 stack of Flying Aureus. It also states that if there are no primary targets to attack, it will just attack a random enemy. I do believe this just means AoE attacks like Lingsha's follow-up attack and random attacks like Aventurine's follow-up attack will have Feixiao attacking a random enemy. Now that we know what Flying Aureus does, what exactly changed? Well, pre-version 3, this follow-up attack had a 200% attack scaling, while post-version 3, the multiplier was changed to 110, so being around half the damage. But this is slightly made up with version 3, providing Feixiao 60% damage bonus which lasts 2 turns every time she does the follow-up attack. So while this follow-up attack is reduced overall, this 60% damage bonus is now applied to her entire kit, which means that her ultimate, which is where most of her damage is coming from, is slightly buffed, and the skill too. Speaking of the skill, it received a nice little change. Pre-version 3, it would have dealt 240 damage and action advanced her by 10%. That 10% in my opinion is pretty negligible, but it would have meant you could get 2 actions in cycle 0 without any speed stats at all. When comparing this scaling, it's similar to Tldr's, which is sitting at 220. But now that we've lost the action advanced, we gained a follow-up attack after skill instead. This is actually a really nice change as it's an overall damage increase as the skill plus follow-up attack has a multiplier of 310, which is a 41% damage increase to pre-version 3. And now you get 2 stacks of Flying Aureus per skill. This will make a Bronya and Feixiao combo fairly viable, especially if you have E2 Feixiao and or E4 Bronya. Just note that this will be pretty skill point intensive though. Next up is the big ult nuke like Acheron, which we saw Skott performing in the beginning. Feixiao's ultimate Terra Split converts each of her Flying Aureus stacks into a hit, with you being able to unleash the ult after a minimum of 6 stacks. While in the attack, you can choose between 2 weapons, and essentially the sword does increased damage if the enemy is weakness broken, and the axe will do increased damage if they weren't. Pre-version 3, every hit had an attack multiplier of 75%, and using the correct weapon would increase that multiplier to 115%. after which the final hit will deal damage increasing by 10 or 35% per flying Ori stack based on if the enemy is weakness broken or not. So for example, if you used only 6 Ori stacks while they weren't broken, the final hit would just do 60. But if they weren't broken, the 6 hits would deal 35 each, so a total of 210. This of course is at a minimum of 6 stacks and a maximum of 12. So the multiplier at level 10 would range from 840 to 1680. What was nice pre version 3 change was that after you killed an enemy, it instantly launched a final attack, which meant you can save the rest of your Ori stacks. I did have one issue though with this version. So say you had 6 stacks and each of your attacks did 1 damage, and the final hit would deal 2. And say that enemy had 4 HP. So rather you doing 2 attacks and then the slam dealing the remaining 2, rather you eat the 4 Ori stacks and then you waste the final hit essentially. Regardless, it was still really cool that you could save your Ori stacks, making it a really flexible ult. Now post version 3, there's no more saving stacks. You will have to use all 6 no matter what. So if you did say have 9 stacks, you'd be left with 3. And if you had 12, then you could ult twice. But how's the damage? Well, it now has a total multiplier of 700%. The initial hits, just like pre-version 3, either hit for 60 if you aren't using the right weapon or 90 if you do, with the final hit being a flat 160% of Feixiao's attack. But just focus on the 700 multiplier post-change and 840 pre. Overall, it's a 17% damage loss, but remember that in her talent, we got a 60% damage bonus, which actually would make the ult deal more damage in most scenarios. And for people saying this gutted her potential because of her low multipliers, cause 700 and 1400 is apparently low nowadays, plus her high self buffs, SMH, I'll make a video on y'all folk next time. But just know basically her ult hits really hard but now lacks the flexibility compared to pre-version 3, as it now can overkill, wasting your stacks. And if the enemy has too much health but not enough to kill with your team's skills, you may need to use the entire ult again, which potentially may suck. Lastly, we got the Trace and Eidolons. First, we have the Trace Heaven's Path. The main thing to note is that you now start with 3 stacks of Flying Aureus at the start of the battle instead of 4. The second condition, I can't lie, doesn't matter too much because it most likely won't happen. It went from you getting an additional stack on your turn when all your teammates were dead, to getting 1 additional stack if none of your teammates attacked. Overall, this could be considered a slight buff for those situations when somehow none of your allies attacked. Next, we have Form Shift. This basically allowed her ult to be considered a follow-up attack. From version 2 to version 3, this gave her follow-up attacks and ult an additional 36 crit damage, which is a clear buff. And now her last trace, Bolt Catch. Pre-version 3, this allowed her follow-up attacks crit damage to increase by 60%, which again includes her ultimate. But now, after you use the skill, Feixiao's attack increased by 48% for 3 turns. This affects her entire kit and now also buffs the skills, which the previous version didn't. This is just a side grade, as we can see when comparing the attack and crit damage artifact main stats. But when looking at the kit overall, it is a slight buff as to not oversaturate Feixiao with crit damage. Now with this, her kit gives 60% damage bonus, 36 crit damage, and 48% attack, with an ult multiplier of 700 and 1400 respectively. This is really dang solid. But while she may not benefit as much as other characters when using harmony units such as Robin, she can work better with nihility units such as Jiao Cho paired with Dr. Ratio or Topaz. But in the future, if they do decide to make a follow-up centric nihility unit like a nihility Robin, well, she'd do pretty well there. Her E1 before, as you can see, just added an additional attack to Feixiao's final hit, which damage increased by 30% of Feixiao's attack for every Flying Aureus stack consumed, meaning that there would have been another 180 or 360% to the multiplier. This was actually pretty dang strong. But again, we need to note that Feixiao's ultimate could potentially overkill, which meant that this final multiplier could have been wasted pretty often. But if the boss was tanky enough to eat all 12 stacks, then this could have been a 43% damage increase. But if you only had 6 stacks, it still would have been around a 20% damage increase. Her new E1 is pretty similar to Danheng Imbiber Lune's Righteous Heart, but actually works slightly differently. While Danheng's gives you damage bonus, this E1 is a whole nother multiplier from what I've read. So assuming you're using her ult right, her new multipliers would look something like this, and would equal a total of 915, which is approximately a 28% damage increase. But unlike Danheng's, which states last to the end of the turn, allowing Danheng to ult and then do an enhanced basic attack, and as such, allowing his basic attacks to start with 30% damage bonus, Feixiao states last until the end of the ultimate action. With this wording, I'm assuming you can't chain two ults together, and as such having the second ult having max buffs the entire time. If this did say till the end of the turn, ulting at 12 stacks would have been pretty dang crazy. Overall, I will say it's a nerf, but it still is pretty good for an E1. Next is E2. Pre-version 3, this reduced the stacks needed for Feixiao to get ult by half. Rather every stack needed 2 attacks, it now only needed 1, which means you only needed 12 attacks rather than 24 for max stacks. And yeah, this was a pretty broken E2. Just imagine Acheron only needed 4 stacks to cast her ult. This, while really cool, most certainly did not need to be in the game. Balance is important, okay? Her new E2 is still very strong, and allows her to get 3 stacks from her skill, and 2 stacks when she launches a follow-up attack from her allies' attack. This of course is super similar to her previous E2, as getting more stacks is pretty much the same as lowering the requirement of getting a stack. This just mostly tuned down adventuring, potentially giving this lady like 4 stacks in one turn if the enemy just kept spamming AoE attacks. This, while being a nerf, is definitely a healthy one for the game, and we did not need this, okay? Her new E4 now increases follow-up vulnerability for the entire team by 10%, which is just a 10% damage increase for follow-up attacks. This is definitely a buff over her previous one, as her skill and basic did not make a majority of her damage. Her E6 had a wording change for the beginning, but still has 20% res pen. What changed would be the follow-up attack, which had its multiplier decreased from 360 to 140. Now the total multiplier including the version 3 follow-up changes would be 250, which is now around the same as a Dr. Ratio chalk. For her light cone, the main thing to note is that you still get 15 crit rate and up to 54 defense ignore on the ultimate, but the way you get these Lumen Flux stacks works a bit differently now. Before, you needed 6 allies to attack to get max stacks, which reset after you ulted, but now it just requires you to do 2 follow-up attacks to get that 54% defense ignore, which the stacks do decrease after your turn, which means you have to do quite a few to get the 2, and then you'll be pretty golden. Every hunt follow-up character could use this light cone, but like not too well because their attacks come from their follow-up attacks and not the ultimate. Overall, this could be considered a nerf as it's much less generalizable and only works really well for follow-up attack characters that have most of their damage coming from their ultimate. Which, you know, there's only one right now. With the Pride 1 tier list, I'd probably place her right next to Acheron as the premium follow-up team is just that strong in my opinion. And even if it is more free to play, like with March or Moze on the team, it's still really strong. Depending if Hoyo makes more single focused MOCs rather than Blast, we may see Hunt and follow-up attack users rise even further, while Acheron, Danheng, Imbiber Lune, and Jingliu might drop. Next is Moze with 12 changes. But in actuality, Moze only actually got one big buff/change for his talent, which was why his kit was not that good in the first place. Essentially, him pre-version 3 did not attack that often, which would be fixed post-version 3. But a lot of the other changes were mostly them just moving different parts of the kit around to different sections, such as swapping Eidolons or moving the Eidolons into the base kit, but some other changes did occur which were a net buff. But starting with his base stats, he has a base of 546, which is tied with the original Daniel. Being a 4-star, he of course has a lower stat spread as opposed to our 5-star counterparts, which is fine. His 114 speed actually makes him the second fastest in the game, but as we will later see, his speed won't really matter. I'm gonna go into this with Moze running attack boots in mind by the way, due to his traces that we'll later see. The only change to his base stats would be to his energy, which went from 110 to 120. This of course is a nerf, but the question is how impactful is this? I'll actually talk about this section near the end because we gotta know how his kit works and his Eidolons before we understand if this is impactful. But for a comparison right now, Topaz is at 130 while Ratio is at 140 energy. His traces has the standard 2 damage and 1 sustain trace, but there's not much to know and there's no changes. Next is his basic, and just like Feixiao, it is the standard basic attack with no changes. For this next part, I will talk about the talent and the skill together as they work side by side. But basically, after Moze's skills, dealing 150% of his attack, he enters the departed state and marks one enemy. In this departed state, he basically leaves the field and as such cannot get hit nor attacks via skill and basic, but he can still ult. When the marked enemy is hit by an ally, then Moze would deal additional damage to them equal to 30% of his attack. This works in the same manner that Ting Yun's Benediction or Robin ult does. If the marked enemy dies, then he would leave said state. The main change is that pre-version 3, Moze would require 7 ally attacks to build his stacks to launch one follow-up attack, dealing damage equal to 200% of his attack, similar to March. But now, after using his skill, he gets 9 charges, which are consumed when the prey gets attacked. After every 3, Moze deals a follow-up attack equal to 160% of his attack, and 185 if you do have E6. This actually has slightly higher multipliers than an unamped Numbi, which deals 150%, but Topaz still has that 50% follow-up vulnerability while Moze right now has a 25%, which we will later see. This follow-up attack also got its toughness damage reduced in half, going from 20 to 10, which is fine because you launch more attacks. Overall, this is a massive W for Moze mains as it allows them to do much more follow-up attacks, meaning more energy and thus more ults, but also more damage. Follow-up attack, which is known for their random BS go strat which deletes enemies with their sheer amount of BS, wouldn't have paired too well with pre-version 3 Moze cause he'd literally be doing nothing for most of the battle. Numbers wise, Moze would have done 200% of his attack with 7 teammate attacks pre-version 3, while post-version 3, he's doing 300% every 6, pre-E6 as well. Also, there's a few cool interactions with him disappearing. Of course, I saw people going the route of he can't get energy because he's not getting attacked, and his teammates are eating all the attacks which makes sustaining harder. But the opposite applies too. Now that there's only 3 teammates around, this will allow them to get a bit more energy as they have a higher chance of getting hit. And if you plan to use a counter team, well, Yunli and Clara are eating good. Then I saw this absolute chef cooking and talking about how you can have 100% uptime with Yukong buff because there's only 3 allies now. I'll post both of these in the description if you want to know a bit more in depth if you're really interested, but I assume there's a lot more you can probably do with this. And onto the ult now. Pre-version 3, Moze gave himself 50% damage bonus lasting 2 turns before dealing 350% of his attack to a selected enemy. And because he's not on field, that 2 turns would actually last quite a while, which would apply to his follow-up attacks. Though if you kept killing the enemy and Moze kept leaving the departed state, it wouldn't last all that long. Post version 3, it would deal 250% attack but also launch a follow-up attack, which the total now is a 400% multiplier of his attack versus the pre of 350. But we don't get the self-damage bonus anymore, but that's actually found in his E4 now. This overall is an upgrade for his follow-up attack teams as that little extra attack from the ult can be super useful. If you do get E4, this is a slight damage decrease I believe, trading 20% damage bonus for a multiplier bonus of 50%. We now can get to his traces and Eidolons. The first trace is called Night Feather, which was just rewarded. But essentially every time you go into the departed state, you will regenerate 1 SP after you do a follow-up attack. This is really nice because it makes him skill point neutral. Pre-version 3, there would be a high likelihood where you would kill the enemies before the 7 stacks, and as such, no follow-up would occur, and that means no SP refund. This will now be less likely to happen as the trigger is now 3, but it can still happen. His next trace is Dagger Hold. This has 2 parts, with the first part remaining the same for both versions. After Moze leaves the departed state, he gets an action advance of 30%. So I actually don't know how this interacts with him leaving the departed state as he isn't on the field anymore. This is because I don't know if he's on the action bar but just invisible, or if he has to run all the way back using his speed. Regardless, the first half of the trace is really nice. The second part of the trace can be summarized like this. Pre-version 3, if you did kill the enemy Moze marked and he did have 4 or more stacks but was not able to use them, he would at least be action advanced by 60% to make this up a little bit. Now, Moze is action advanced by 30% at the start of every wave. Using this, I would assume this plus his high base speed would allow him to be the fastest of your team if they are sitting near the 134 mark. This would thus allow you to run attack boots and not worry too much about going after your team. This could potentially not be the way to go depending on how the departed state works and if getting back into the state would be a hassle without speed boots. But with my assumption, I'm just gonna assume that we're gonna be able to run attack boots, so I personally say this is a buff. Okay, this next part might be confusing, but basically his trace 3, E1, and E2 do the same thing but have just been swapped around. And he got a new E4, but this new E4 is actually part of his old ultimate, while the old E4 is now being moved to a different Eidolon. So his old E1 is now his trace 3, his old E2 is now his E1, and his old trace 3 is now his E2. I will just quickly say it is a slight upgrade for those at low investment, as you now get the follow-up vulnerability in the base kit and his energy Eidolon at E1, whereas before you got the follow-up vulnerability at E1 and the energy trace at E2, which the energy trace is really important, by the way. Okay, but let's just see what these traces actually do. So the new trace 3 is the same as the old E2. And this 25% vulnerability for follow-up attacks on the marked target is actually pretty huge, as it increases your follow-up damage by 25%. This is just like Topaz's mechanic, which gives a 50% vulnerability to the target, and we all know how powerful that is. And plus, his ultimate damage is now also considered a follow-up attack. His new E1 or old E2 gives him 20 energy at the start of the battle, which is actually huge for the math I'm about to do soon. This is really important for Moze as he's able to ult near his first turn, and definitely something that Moze main should try to get. The second half did get slightly nerfed with his additional damage generating 1 less energy, going from 3 to 2, though I don't know how major this change is and don't know if there may be a difference in hitting a new energy threshold, but someone in the comments may know, so I'll leave it up to them. And lastly, his E2 now, or his old trace 3, now gives 20 more crit damage to attacks on the prey. But this additional 20% was actually located in his old E4, and he actually got a new E4 instead. But his new E4, which grants 30% damage bonus for 2 turns after the ult, is actually just a weaker version of the second part of the original ult. Oh, and his E6 is now just part of his new ultimate in the base kit, where he launches an additional follow-up attack, with the new E6 now just being a slight multiplier increase of 25% to the follow-up attack. This is around a 16% damage increase, but it's still really nice. Jeez, that was super confusing. Okay, now to the energy. So pre-version 3 at the start of the battle will start with 55 energy, and after skilling and entering the departed state will be at 85 energy. After which Moze would need 7 teammates to attack just to deal 1 follow-up attack, and now sits at 95 energy. And after leaving the departed state, we'll need 1 more skill to ult. With the old E2, which is basically the new E1 instead, Moze would actually start with 75 energy and get 3 energy per attack that hits the marked enemy. So after skilling, we're at 105 energy, and as such only need 2 attacks to hit the marked enemy to ult. So how does this compare with post version 3? Well, we now start with 60 energy, and then skill, which gets us to 90. Getting all 3 modes of follow-up attacks grants us 30 energy, getting us to 120, and then will let us immediately ult after we leave the departed state / our 3rd follow-up attack. As you can see, it's already better than pre-version 3. But with the new E1, we start with 80 energy instead. And after you skill and enter the departed state, we now sit at 110. With just 1 follow-up attack after 3 teammates hit the marked target, we are able to ult. But as you can see, getting this new energy E1 is really important. If I were to talk about how I think he would rank in Pride win terms, I think I'd put him in tier 1 right next to March 8th, and then also move Topaz up a tier. So overall, I think Moze is in a really good spot right now. And seeing how he's apparently going to be paired with Feixiao's banner, who knows? I just heard it somewhere, I don't know. Moze mains already. And that is everything, jeez. I want to say thank you guys if you made it this far, if you listened to all of that. And I hope you learned something from my analysis. I just hit 1,000 subscribers just a few days ago and just want to say thank you so much. I've always wanted to be a YouTuber when I was a little kid, but always thought it was just a pipe dream. But hey, look at me now. I got people watching me and enjoying my content maybe. So hell yeah. My next video should be a Genshin one, but let me know in the comments if you have any questions or video ideas. Thank you for watching and peace everyone.